So first of all, I'm quite excited to meet you in person. I've grown up reading your stories. We all have.
Well, I hope you won't be disappointed now that you're here. And it's good to meet you and to talk to you.
I've seen your interviews. I've read about you when you were getting ready for this interview. Uh, I don't think you have shared much about your childhood. Would you like to share something?
To tell you about it, I would have to go back to the 1940s, early 40s, when I was with my parents in Jamnagar, which was on the west coast of India. It was a small state then. And in fact, Jamnagar was the home state of the great Ranjit Singh ji, the cricketer. So sometimes I'd be taken as a small boy to watch cricket matches, and I wasn't too interested in cricket at the age of 5, but they always served nice gulab jamuns and rasgullas and jalebis. So for that I used to go to the match. So it was almost a fairy tale atmosphere, Jamnagar in those days. Then World War II broke out, and my father went into the Air Force, into the RAF, and life changed. And
Your father was a fighter pilot, I
no, he wasn't a fighter pilot. He was, when war broke out, he was already in his 40s. So he was in what was called codes and ciphers,
Okay.
which was intelligence actually.
Okay.
And for that he was posted first in Delhi, then in Calcutta, and he died when I was still 9 or 10 years old in the course of the war. So then I lived with my mother and a stepfather in Dehradun. Went to school in Simla, and well, it was during my school days that the germs of wanting to be a writer actually took root.
So I wanted to ask you this question because being a writer was not quite popular in the era you were growing in. I mean, how did you decide to be a writer?
You're right, it wasn't very a fashionable occupation. There were, of course, famous writers around, but for a boy or possibly even a girl, it was not a profession that you thought of following normally. In fact, and when I finished school and I came home, and my mother said, "Well, now what are you going to do with yourself, Ruskin?" And I said, "Mom, I think I'm going to be a writer." She said, "Don't be silly. Go and join the army." Huh? In those days, boys went into the army because actually career opportunities were very limited as compared to what they are now. And of course, I wasn't interested in the army. Um, I would have been another Beetle Bailey, I think, if I had gone into it. Huh? So I said, so I stuck to my ambition of wanting to be a writer, which had been there even before I'd finished school. And I started banging away at an old typewriter and writing stories, and then I was packed off to England because my mother thought I'd have a better future there or something. And while I was there, I wrote my first novel, which was written actually out of a certain homesickness and a longing for India, for the place I'd grown up in, for friends, and all the attachments that are there.
So what was your age then?
Then I was 17
You were only 70 when you launched your first
when
novel.
I wrote it, the first draft. But it took me a year or two to get a publisher. So I pursued publishers in London and finally found one who was very encouraging, but I had to, I think, write that book at least 3 times before it got published.
You rewrite it.
Rewrite it, do another draft and another, which is the hardest I've ever worked on a book. But it was the first one, and in a way it set me off on a very long literary journey.
You even got an award for that, I think.
I did when it was the thing is, when it got published, I was already back in India, because the advance I got in those days, it was £50. That was the standard advance, but that was enough to bring me back to India by sea. In those days, you travelled by sea. £40 was the fare. So when I got down in Bombay, I still had £10,
Okay.
enough to get back home to Dehradun. But I did get, and then an award. It was published after I'd come back,
Okay.
come
Okay.
home.
Okay.
And then I was told I got this award, the John Llewellyn Rees Prize.
Yeah.
It was quite a prestigious award,
Yes.
and but you couldn't live on an award.
Absolutely.
So I had to start um, writing very regularly. And in those days in India, we didn't have many book publishers, apart from academic publishers and school books, but not many who were doing fiction or general literature. So I had to write a lot for magazines, newspapers, which was why a lot of my early work consisted of short stories, and essays. And but that built up over the years too.
So what do you like writing more, sir? Is it, I mean, short stories, novel,
Yeah, short
poetry?
stories.
What?
Usually, the shorter the better. Because I'm I like to get on with a thing. I'm impatient, so if, I can't write a 500-page novel.
So you just
And in any case, if I can say as much as I want to in 200 pages, and why write 200 pages when I can say the same thing in 20 pages? Or write 20 pages when I can say do it in 2 pages.
But
So
isn't it
sometimes-
difficult to crisp that much?
Pardon? Well, no, it depends on what you're writing about, of course. A short story, you're sort of zooming in on a particular incident or a episode or a character or just a moment in time, you might say, and trying to preserve it. Whereas in a long novel, you're perhaps covering generations of family. So it depends on really what you enjoy most, in a way. So the kind, and I like putting words together. I like writing a beautiful sentence, which is why sometimes I like writing poetry too. And poetry is not a commercial thing. Everybody writes poetry. I keep meeting everyone I meet nowadays. They're writing poems, but naturally, you can't make a living from writing poetry.
So
And even-
since you are talking about nowadays, we see a lot of writers on social media. I mean, they write poems or
Yes.
like short
That's
paragraphs.
fine.
So what do you think of now and then? I mean, you have been
Yeah.
you started when you used to write on typewriter,
Yeah.
and now it's social media. Do you think the scene has changed?
Yes, of course it has changed. With social media has changed things. I haven't changed. I'll change ugly janam when. At the moment, I'm technologically illiterate. But so I write the way I've always written. In fact, I'm going backwards. I used to type. Now I write by hand.
Okay.
That's because typing gives me a stiff neck anyway.
Okay.
So I'm more comfortable writing with a ballpoint and a pad. And I can do that anywhere, in this chair or at my desk or in bed or under a tree outside. So, and my handwriting is legible. My publishers don't mind it.
But don't you think the poetry has become more popular because people are themselves writing on social media these days?
Yeah, people like to express themselves, and maybe social media gives them that opportunity. Whereas in earlier times, you were writing for yourself, basically. You weren't communicating. But then again, writing is something that you do basically for yourself. If you were not enjoying what you put down on paper, whether it's a story or a poem or a book, if you were not enjoying it, you wouldn't do it. You're not doing it really for a third person. That comes later on. Maybe if you've done something good. So basically, you're doing it for yourself, and if you then have somebody else reading it and appreciating it, that's fine.
So if I may ask, I mean, you have written so much, it will be very stupid of me to ask it, but I will still ask it. What do you think are your best works according to you? I mean, or maybe what have you enjoyed most writing?
It's when I'm enjoying something and at that particular time when I'm writing it, that's probably my favorite. At the moment of writing, if it's going well. And then looking back over the years, I have a soft spot for the things I wrote when I was in my teens, 20s. You could say that was my romantic period. I was, writing about encounters on railway platforms. In fact, some of my better known stories were written a long time ago, and the times have changed. Now you don't meet have romantic meetings on railway platforms. You have to have them at airports, I think.
Yeah. Or maybe on social media,
Social
on
media,
Facebook,
yeah,
Tinder.
social media has taken over, yeah.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about your struggling days when you were growing up, when
Yeah.
you started as a writer?
Okay, right. Well, after finishing school and before I was packed off to England, I was started writing, but I was very new to it then, and I borrowed an old typewriter, and I was lucky I had one or two stories published in the Illustrated Weekly of India, which was then the sort of premier magazine in India. And others I would try different places.
Was it easier to get a slot there?
No, it was very difficult in the weekly, but it was easier in some other smaller magazines and papers. But they didn't pay much. And there was a little magazine published down in Madras, Chennai, which was called My Magazine of India. And I used to send them all my rejects of which I couldn't publish elsewhere. And they would, for each story, they would send me a money order for 5 rupees. 5 rupees was the payment. But with 5 rupees, I could see 3 films, and even buy maybe a book or a paperback. So I would send them stuff too. I don't know. I've never seen them again. Those are all lost stories. They weren't very good. Then I wrote for all kinds of papers, because in those days they would all publish short stories or fiction. So I wrote for Sainik Samachar, the Defence Forces Weekly. I wrote for a paper in Allahabad called The Leader. I wrote for Sport and Pastime, and a film magazine called Mother India.
So, how did you overcome your struggling days? What exactly did you do, or you just?
I was staying in this flat in Dehradun, which I'd rented from a lady who had a little shop downstairs, and she hadn't paid the Bijli bill for 3 years. And I couldn't afford the Bijli bill either. So I was 2 years in this flat without light,
Electricity.
Without electricity. So that I could write in the evenings or at night, I had a kerosene lamp.
Okay.
So I used to write by a kerosene lamp, and it was very hot in summer because of the fan didn't work either. And I couldn't pay the arrears myself because they had mounted up into thousands.
So, sir, if you have to give a message to the viewers who are watching this interview, maybe some of them want to be a writer someday.
Yeah,
What will your
I
message
keep
be?
meeting young people who want to be writers, who are writers and want to be published. Sometimes are very impatient and want to see their name on a book cover. Don't take your savings or your parents' money and pay 2 or 3 lakhs to a vanity publisher, to someone to print your book. Because a lot of people do that sometimes nowadays.
Okay.
It's great to do a book, but it's better that you should get something for it. And it's been throughout my life my principle to insist that I should be paid for my work, and I shouldn't be paying the publisher to print it. Whereas a lot of people do that now, and in the long run it doesn't help, because the publisher will print your book, will give you your 500 copies or whatever you ordered, and then what do you do with them? Because he's not going to sell them. You have to then, you're going to end up just giving them away to your friends. Because professionally a book is sold through not just a publisher or the author, but through a distributor and a bookseller, and there's a whole
Yes.
system there. So in a way it's self-defeating. So it's best to be patient, make sure that your work is good, then give it to a professional and a good, reliable publisher who will give you a contract and a royalty, and then you will earn something from it.
So don't be impatient is your message.
Don't be impatient. Yeah.
Sir, thanks a lot for allowing us
Thank you.
to meet
Thank
you,
That was
giving
fun.
us
I
time.
enjoyed it.
It's really a pleasure.